so I haven't done a beef topic in a while, so I'm going to talk about weaning, and the story today is all about immunity and why immunity drives better, more successful weaning, more profitable weaning. It's better for the animals, the farmer, and the overall farm business. Immunity is absolutely key. When we look at all diseases, and we're all learning about it, the importance of immunity, it is just fundamentally we're trying to maximize immunity. So how does that, when we think about weaning, and apologies for the art, when we come up to weaning, it's a critical point in a suckler system. How does weaning create stresses? We know it does. What are the main ones, and what can we do to drive immunity? If we think about some of the key challenges, parasites are probably a place to start. It's been very favourable conditions for parasites over the last couple of weeks and months. Now, beef calves are the advantages they're suckling and probably not consuming as much grass, which is where the risk of parasites are, until maybe July and August is where we see the increased risk, and we're right into that now. When there's two parasites we need to really focus on, and that's our gutworms, our roundworms, and I think we need to put a strategy in place, particularly when we want to reduce anthelmintics, around fecal egg counts, and then, you know, just weights, fecal egg counts, and knowing that we're probably at a risk period. I think that's very useful. Lungworm is a big challenge because it's incredibly unpredictable, and I think lungworm, we can be pretty sure from what I'm hearing and seeing, is a risk this year on a lot of farms, especially if you've had history of it in the past. Now, so lungworm is a challenge. It's unpredictable, and often we have to go on clinical signs. We don't want weanings coming up to calves coming up to weaning time and having coughing and lungworm in there, because it does irritation to the airways. It opens the doorway to other pathogens. It's an extra stressor. So parasite control is critical. There's different products, and every farm is slightly different. Feeding is on both sides of the immunity story, because where we have issues with feeding, we can really play into immunity. Nutrition drives immunity in our animals and ourselves. So feeding is important, and I think this idea of creep feeding, you know, obviously having calves getting as much grass into them before weaning as possible, but creep feeding, that meal feeding coming up to weaning time allows for a smoother transition, and meal feeding after. During our suckler, our cow suckler scheme many years ago, that was mandatory, and it really worked well on farms. A lot of farms kept doing it. So good feeding, getting that rumen primed, ready, and for that transition away from milk. But I think it's feeding, so good feeding plays into immunity. Stress, this is the big one. This is an area I've probably become very interested in our farming systems in general, is understanding what stress is for animals when it comes to their behaviour and the challenges we see at different management stages. And weaning is a big stress, and there's studies been done, and it's very interesting stuff if you look at it. You know, what does the calf miss more, the milk or the mother? And it is the mother, it is that taking away from the mother that's the most stressful event. So what can we do around weaning time to help that? And a lot of people have seen the paddles used and noses, which would stops the milk, but allows the calf to be with the mother still. And what you're doing is a two-phase weaning then. And some of the studies looked at that calves that had weaned abruptly walked 25 miles in 2 days. Calves that had the two-phase weaning system with the like of the paddles used, they walked 10 miles. Now that 15 miles extra is extra energy, it's extra stress, it's affecting on immunity. So two-stage weaning, again, if you're weaning groups taking a number of cows out of the system at periods, so you're not taking all the cows at the one time, that works well. We just need to manage stress, because stress has a direct impact on the immune system of the calf, and that really opens the door for diseases. Minerals are important as well. They can be very farm specific. Some of the big ones I see is iodine, selenium and copper. What's your mineral status of your herbage in your farm? Have you any idea? Do you need to do blood minerals? And then supplement accordingly, because minerals can play a role. Pain is another one. So pain obviously causes stress, which is a big impact on immunity. So if we're looking at castration or dehorning around weaning time, it's a big no-no coming up to weaning, and you want to separate that out. You want to have it done early if possible at all, but the use of pain relief or anti-inflammatory medication, particularly for castration and are dehorning. And I always say to farmers, if you don't believe me, just if you're doing castrating a group of calves, give half of them anti-inflammatories, mark them, and give the other half. And go back to them after 8 to 10, 24 hours. You'll see the difference. It just makes sense. The weather, does the weather cause diseases? Does the weather cause pneumonia? Weather creates stress and changes in dietary intakes, which opens the door, like ourselves when we see weather changes, to risk of immune stress. So weather can be something to factor in coming up to weaning time. The big things that affect immunity are, I suppose, disease, but we have to look at it in two ways. When we look at particularly pneumonia as a risk around weaning time, every infectious disease, it's the amount of infection pressure, which is the amount of pathogens or bugs, versus immunity. So if we've good immunity and we can keep infection pressure down, we won't see disease issues. Where you see a massive rise in infection pressure, even good immunity can be overcome. But what's happening at weaning time is immunity is going down. A lot of these pathogens are in our herds, and so if we look at the viruses from a pneumonia perspective, IBR, RSV, PI3. Okay, most herds will have the RSVs and the PI3s circulating. So if we have stressful events affecting immunity, well then these viruses can show clinical symptoms. A lot of our bacteria, so Manhemia being the main one, these are naturally in the windpipe and tonsils of a lot of our cattle. So if stress and immunity drops, this infection pressure does need to be very high to cause symptoms. And that's where we call shipping fever, where we have stressful events around transport. Weaning is a key time for that. So that's absolutely key, that the immunity piece when it comes to disease is here. Yes, disease can affect immunity, but the inherent risk at weaning time is all these other stressors occurring, particularly that, as I said, the actual physiological stress of weaning itself. So we need to be mindful that a lot of our respiratory pathogens are present in our herds. IBR, very commonly talked about, certainly it affects a lot of herds. Now, when you look at IBR, there's a couple of strands to it. Now I think we're looking at eradication programs, we're looking at, it's an economically significant disease from a trading perspective, so it's something that suckler farmers need to keep a close eye on. I think a lot of farmers need to be thinking about IBR strategies and IBR vaccination. So there's definitely the challenge is there. Obviously there's another big factor on immunity is when we change anything, when we change weaning, when we change diet, when we change the environment. So if we come up to weaning and it's at housing time, you're then putting another stressor on top of that, on top of those weanings. So we need to be very mindful in housing around, we've changed the environment, we could be changing the feed. What do we do there? Again, feeding consistency coming in as much as possible, but fresh air in the house, space, water is a really important one for weanings, all ruminants. So that's another stressor, we need to manage that as well. So when you come and look at it, there's a number of challenges on immunity. So then we've got to think about, and I mentioned Mycoplasma as a bacteria, I'll come to it again. What we need to think about is what we can do. So feeding, I've kind of covered it, that creep feeding of concentrates coming up to weaning and after weaning is a very sensible approach. Planning, monitoring animals after weaning. So typically what I see with disease is when you see stressful events, you typically see the symptoms of them 10 to 14 days after. If you have weaning and sale at the same day, when are those animals going to get sick? When are they going to show issues? So you need to monitoring is really important of animals. Planning out your protocol for your farm around parasites, all those other risks is really important. Having a farm specific plan, working with someone like your vets and advisors around that is key. So I suppose if I have one point today, it is why vaccination makes such sense in weaning systems, particularly when we look at our respiratory pathogens. This is a stressful event. We know that this physiologically is a challenge for our weanlings. What can we do to prime immunity in advance of that? And that's why the vaccination works well, particularly our pneumonia vaccines, obviously. And there's a couple of options when we look at vaccination. So if you come up to weaning, typically if we've got bacterial pathogens and viral agents, are we combining them into a vaccine? Most of those vaccines are dead vaccines. They're all dead vaccines, in fact, in the Irish market. So you need to give one shot which spikes up immunity. The second shot is absolutely key, because what any vaccine does is it primes the immune system. So the first shot is initial primer, and then the secondary one really allows for that immunity to last for a long period of time. And with all vaccination, it's key that the vaccine is given before the risk period, and it's at its most, the highest immunogenic response is around the risk period. So 2 shots. So we need to be thinking about that now, and this is why I'm putting out this video a little bit earlier. So that's your dead vaccines. Now, if you're coming up to weaning, you have also the option of maybe using intranase or intramuscular live vaccines. They're typically all viruses, your RSVs, your PI3s, your IBRs. Again, these live vaccines often require one shot to begin with, particularly intranasal, but your cover goes up a bit quicker, but it doesn't last as long. So you have a shorter window, but you still want them working. So what I often see is weaning time. Calves get at weaning, get separated, get dosed, to get vaccinated. We are asking the immune system at a stressful time to react to a vaccine to get a good immune response. We're not getting value for money. So really the timing of vaccines is really important. Now everybody asks me, what dose will I use? What vaccine will I use? That's farm specific, and that is a conversation for your own vet. Just my key message, if there's one key message today, is getting the timing of vaccine right in advance of weaning. You'll get much better results. Farmers will say to me, I don't use vaccines, don't have an issue, and that's fair enough. When you look at those systems, a lot of this stuff is done really, really well. What vaccines do in those situations is they're a security policy, because we don't know what stressful events will come in, weather-wise or anything like that. And a lot of this comes down, of course, to the management of the farm. You know, your part-time, what your handling facilities, what's doable. But if you do focus and do spend time and effort getting this stuff right in advance of weaning, along with the minimising stress, it can be very beneficial. So the right vaccines, the timing is critical. Administration, so this is something, I know it's very simple, but we pay a lot of money for vaccines. They don't get used in the correct route or manner, and that's a real challenge. And again, a lot of these, particularly these live vaccines, these intranasal, intramuscular vaccines, you often have to make them up. They have a very specific storage requirements because of the active ingredients, so storing them properly. Vaccines aren't a magic bullet, but we're all learning it. We're learning about a couple of things. If you think about housing and our kids go back to school and the disease pressure comes on, animals are the same. We're learning about the value of vaccination when it comes to respiratory disease. So vaccines make sense. We have them available. You need to be considering them. They will pay back, and I think we have the huge advantage in Ireland at the moment of our BPS scheme, where there was one of the three pillars was set aside for vaccination. Because ultimately we're trying to keep animals healthy, we're trying to reduce our antibiotic usage. And if you look in beef farms, where all the antibiotic usage goes, or a large percentage of it, it's the treatment of respiratory disease around weaning time when we've younger animals or calves. So pneumonia is a big challenge, and this is something we can take action on. Just a quick point on the cow. Obviously it's a stressful event for her. Her dry matter intakes will go down around weaning time or after weaning time. It's a risk for grass technique, so just be aware of that in your farm as well. Okay, I did mention, I should have come back to it, I've seen a lot of issues with Mycoplasma Pneumonia on this side of the scale. When animals have been sold, store cattle have been bought in, purchased, a lot of reports of Mycoplasma. It seems to be a pathogen that's, it's very common in dairy farms, but we're seeing more of it in suckler farms. There's no vaccine for it, and it's very difficult to treat because of the nature of the bacteria itself. So when you have these areas covered off well, and you cover a lot of these diseases, you'll see much better or lower risk to mycoplasma, minimising stress. Okay, just a couple of points. If weaning is such a stressful point, sale and transport, if we combine them around the same time, we're putting huge pressure on these weanlings. We're trying to reduce down stress for better immunity. It's better farming all around. Now, one of the challenges here is, of course, a part of this industry is purchasing these weanlings, and it's something I think we need to get better at, because the challenge is there to reduce antibiotic usage. I continue to see, particularly last year, so a lot of issues with weanings being purchased in, difficult, lots of pneumonia, difficult treatments, lameness. Mycoplasma was high up the list. So when you're purchasing, and I know when you're buying from smaller farms, you're trying to get up numbers, it's difficult, but the history of the farm knowledge, direct purchasing makes a huge amount of sense. What's the UNA status if you're looking at replacements? What are IBR status? What's the vaccine status? And we must remember, mixing animals in groups together, not unlike what we're learning about coronavirus, so different people going into groups, mixing animals, it causes huge stress because you're changing the environment, different groups, and you will have a lot of shedding of these bacteria and of these viruses in particular. Transport is another challenge. If you spend a bit of time thinking about how many animals go in the box, loading them up as stress-free as possible, it's something that 10 years ago I wouldn't have thought about a lot of this stuff, but to me now it's becoming absolutely fundamental as part of the story of understanding how we build these farm systems. And what's the immunity status of the animals that you're buying? What are the factors in here? To me, it's a little bit different maybe approach, but I think it's all about immunity when it comes up to weaning time. It's all about maximising that immunity so we minimise down the risk of disease at weaning time. Knowing what the risks are, knowing what we can do, and my key thing is if you are going to be using vaccines that do make sense, use them correctly, time them now, be thinking about in your head what's the right protocol for your farm. And that's my top tips. A little bit early on weaning, but there's a reason for it. It is to be proactive and thinking ahead. Happy, safe farming.